Hello and welcome, Star People. It is your cosmic detective and intrepid star guide 8 p.m. back with part 2 of the criminal astrology overview for exploration into criminal astrology. So trigger warning remains in effect if this is not your type of scene. And by the way, I'm not going in deeply into crimes, but I may touch upon them, and you feeling the need to step away for your own self-care, please feel free to do so. See ya next week, or please choose another one of our groovier episodes. A quick reminder, our daily Stargazer newsletter keeps you connected to the cosmos, and you may find that via the notes via the links in the show notes. And you can also find us on Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube. Those links are also in the show notes. And thank you very much for tuning in. And with that being said, on with the show. Alrighty, Star People. We're going to look deeper into the chart. And we're going to talk about aspects, patterns, lunar nodes, and that sort of thing in this particular episode. So what we're going to be looking at is the angles in particular. So we're going to look at the angles because very important. The lunar nodes, and I want to keep it short and sweet so that you can get the information and consider it as you need rather than overwhelming you with way too much information. So let's dive in. So the angles are very important in charts. They're important in charts because in traditional astrology and in all astrology, these are like considered to be your incarnation crosses. And so the ascendant's important because it represents you in the chart. In a traditional astrology, it's you. In modern eclectic astrology, as I practice it, and my mentors practice it, and I've got quite a few, it is how you see yourself. It is underneath. It is in houses 1 through 6. Those are personal. That has nothing to do with what other people see when they look at you, which is why I disagree with the psychological assertion that it is a mask that you wear. A mask that you wear would be something that people could see. I would be looking at the MC for that and planets in the 10th house, because that has to do with your public image, not your identity, which is the first house. So the ascendant represents the initial crime scene appearance, the victim's first impression, meaning the victim when they're seen, the first impression of them, and how the case first comes to light, and any immediate circumstances around discovery. Okay, so you're going to be, I lean more toward looking at what it might say about the victim than about the perpetrator. The Imam Quelli, otherwise known as the MC, and the ascendant obviously is just the ascendant. So anyway, the Imam Quelli represents hidden aspects of the victim's life, family secrets that may be related to the case, buried evidence or clues, and psychological roots to the crime. So I'd be looking at any aspects of the crime also that may have had their roots in the past, and in particular with the family, the victim's family, and people they considered, whether that be blood family or found family. I would be looking at the fourth house and the ascent and the IC for that. Now the descendant is the other, okay? And usually in Placidus, I use whole sign houses for all of my charts, unless I say differently, then it will be porphyry. But when in Placidus, you're not going to see a descendant because it'll be clicked right on top of that seventh house cusp. But in whole signs, it moves, which is why I like whole signs. And so the descendant represents the perpetrator's appearance. I would say less is their appearance and more the perpetrator themselves. Relationship dynamics, how the perpetrator might have chosen the victim, and the public face of the suspect. I will also say I would look deeply into the 7th house to see if the victim and the perpetrator had an adversarial relationship or a confrontational one in the past, because that would give me a lot more information about the crime. The midheaven is called medium quelli. It is located at the top of the chart. In Placidus, it'll be at the cusp of the 10th house. However, with whole signs, it tends to move. And it represents the public perception of the crime, any media coverage, investigations, reputation, the investigator's reputation, the reputation of the investigation, the career impacts on any involved parties of the crime, in addition, the public perception of said crime as well. I know I said that, but it does bear repeating. So those are the angles of the chart in criminal astrology. Now we're moving on to the lunar nodes. And then we'll circle back for my thoughts. So lunar nodes are as follows. The north node represents the future direction of the investigation, evolving investigative techniques, and growth areas in criminal justice or in criminal astrology, but in criminal justice in particular. So that's the north node. The north node does come from Vedic astrology, otherwise known as Yotis astrology, and it is a completely different thing when done there, but it has somehow moved itself, matriculated itself into Western modern eclectic astrology, and so this is what it could and does represent, at least how I practice criminal astrology. Now the south node represents past criminal patterns, habitual behaviors of the perpetrator, and familiar investigative methods and historical case connections. Now you understand that there is a push and a pull between the north and the south node. The south node is usually the direction in which we want to go. So it also represents, for a criminal chart, the direction in which not necessarily the perpetrator, but the investigators have an idea of which they want the case to go. And so too does the perpetrator. So the perpetrator might be thinking, I want it to go this way. I would prefer that it go this way, meaning I evade capture. Because, who wants to spend thousands of years in prison, particularly in certain jurisdictions in certain countries? That could be a very long prison sentence, if not an outright death sentence, okay? So that is one way of looking at a chart, but also the south node is what's comfortable. What do they lean back on? So it's always going to be a tension between the direction of the investigation should go that way, but investigators have strengths. They have pet peeves. They have anathemas. They have biases, which sometimes can work in their favor, but more often than not, tends to not work in their favor. And sometimes they may not be aware of it until events transcribe that make everybody aware of the fact, including themselves, that the way they're seeing the case is becoming a problem. Okay? So the south node for investigators is sometimes leaning on their experience and knowledge, which can work out for them, and sometimes it is to their detriment. Consider that all points in any chart can be for good or ill, based on the choices of the people involved. All charts are neutral until a choice tips the balance one way or the other. Okay? So the nodal axis together can represent connections between victim and perpetrator, turning points in the investigation, collective lessons from the crime, and the cyclical nature also of human nature and also criminal behavior. Why? Because criminal behavior is usually motivated by emotion. We don't make choices without emotions being involved. Even the most so-called objective, meaning third party, I'm a side, I'm out here, I've got no skin in the game, even that can change. Emotions can tilt behavior one way or another for good or for ill. Even a happy feeling can be a bad thing if that happy feeling is what makes me happy is hurting other people. Okay? So, as it stands, this is what these are the angles, and this is the nodal axis. Now, the next point I want to consider in this chart is called black moon Lilith. Now, black moon Lilith is a mathematical point. It's hypothetical. That's why we call it hypothetical. It's not a real point in space that you can go out there and touch with your hands or even perceive with your eyes. It is, in fact, a mathematical point measuring the distance in the elliptical orbit of the moon round the Earth, and the black moon Lilith is the lunar apogee, as opposed to perigee. Perigee is close, meaning the moon is close to the Earth, and the apogee would be the furthest distance the moon could be away from the Earth in its orbit around the Earth. Okay? And so when we're looking at that, that's an added interesting point that we can add to a chart. And here is some of the things that black moon Lilith can mean. So, black moon Lilith can be a dark, repressed motivations, taboo aspects of the crime, and shadow elements of investigation, or any denied or suppressed evidence. And that would make it interesting for a criminal chart, is because, well, most crimes usually involve someone getting harmed, and those have dark, what we call dark, meaning negative or repressed motivations, because sometimes we see ourselves in a certain way, and it can be very difficult for us to see ourselves differently. If we see ourselves as a nice person and someone comes along and says something like, "You're a terrible person," we're going to have a very difficult, it's going to be quite difficult for us to see ourselves in that way, which is why in psychology, as practiced by people with medical degrees, people with schooling, not life coaches, not people that we follow on Instagram and who are social influencers and thought leaders, not. I mean, people with, who went to school and have had all of the training and the case studies and the case histories and all of the logged hours to say, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist, I have the training, I have the schooling to back this up, kind of thing, plus also the years of experience. And the reason why I mention that is because we can get into some really touchy waters, some very dodgy waters, when we're dealing with the dark and repressed. Why? Because even a trained psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist is going to stay away from trying to break down a person's identity. It's considered, what is the word I would use? I'm having a hard time finding the right word, but it's basically a don't do sort of thing. You leave the individual's identity intact because you don't know what fuddling with it will do. And so black moon Lilith represents those parts of ourselves, or in parts of the perpetrator in particular, because most investigations, when they're seeking the perpetrator, are trying to understand how this person thinks. Because if you can understand how they think, you can then understand how to catch them. The victim is usually, in a lot of true crime, not around anymore to offer any insight. Otherwise, there'd be no need to do all of this true crime, because in most of the true crime I tend to look at is the true crime where the victim usually doesn't make it, and all we have is the perpetrator, and the perpetrator hasn't been caught yet, or if they have been caught, they're not particularly chatty about what their motivations are, and quite frankly, they may not even know what they are. And so Black Moon Lilith represents that part of criminal behavior, that part of the perpetrator that has repressed emotions or repressed motivations. Maybe those crimes are sexually motivated. Like in the case of an arson case that happened, I think, in the Washington, D.C. And very briefly, it was a series of houses being burnt. And people did die. And the motivation for the crime was that this particular perpetrator would set fire to the houses of people that he was attracted to. And since he had been raised in a culture that said being attracted to other males was not acceptable, he tended to express his feelings, whatever they might have been, sadness, rage, any number of things, by setting fire to these people's homes. And so that, it would be considered a repressed motivation, because this guy was not trying to know that about himself. He was not trying to know that. He was setting the fire so he didn't have to know it. And that is how you might see Black Moon Lilith showing up in a chart. Is that in any of the planets, any of the points showing up in a chart, when you have them talking in any way, shape, or form, we should never think that this is absolutely definitive, this is fixed, this is how it is. It is most certainly not how it is. Okay. Now, aspects in a chart don't function that much differently than regular psychological astrology. I will add my notes, however, by saying when we're looking at, say, a conjunction between any planet or point is usually unconscious. So any planets in a perpetrator's chart, in the crime scene chart, those conjunct planets are going to be functioning mostly unconsciously. Any points opposite one another, that's a tension, that's a push and a pull. You've got one planet on one side insisting, and I say insisting because I'm using animism. I'm making the planets speak through me. And so basically one need the planet represents is going up against another need the planet represents. So Mars is in, say, hypothetically, you have a Mars in aspect to Venus, for example. Venus wants to relate. Mars wants to assert. Mars is about sex. Venus is about, pleasure. Those two things in signs that oppose are not necessarily fabulous. So let's say that we got Venus at home in Taurus and we got Mars hanging out at home in its traditionally ruled sign of Scorpio. Those two tensions are about pleasure, comfort, that sort of thing. So let's say we're looking at a chart of someone who has killed someone, and what might be the motivations? Well, Mars gives you motivation, absolutely. And if it's an aspect to Venus, we've got a desire for comfort and to avoid change, which means, okay, you got a need here, which means, let's just say for the sake of this example, it's sexually motivated. You have a need for comfort, but you also have a need to get this sexual need met. And maybe it's one of those darker so-called needs that are not socially appropriate. And you can feel free to fill that part in a way that feels comfortable for you. Okay? But that would represent, let's say these two are opposing and they both square Black Moon Lilith in Leo. Black Moon Lilith in Leo would be very much about being seen, being heard, and also in this particular chart, it's all about me, and also me. So you'd also then look for the sun in that chart, which would give you some ideas about the male perpetrator, whatever sign. We're not going to go too deeply into that. But this that I just showed you, two planets opposing plus a third point being added that both square, is called a T-square. It is not stable. It tends to be a little bit chaotic, and everything is going energetically out through that, vibrationally and energetically out through that Black Moon Lilith in Leo, which is all about me, and more about me and my needs. What about what I want? What about my desires? What about what delights me, what gives me pleasure, which may not be things socially that other people find acceptable. So in this particular example, which is all fixed, this would be a hard energy for a person with this chart, especially if they're a perpetrator, which for this example they are, to fight. It's not an energy that goes away. It's a very stubborn to get rid of energy and a stubborn energy to try to navigate because it's very tense. It wants to be resolved, which means there's a push to go out there and do something about it. But this energy is not, let's get it started, set it off energy. It's going to simmer for a bit and it's going to build for a bit. So by the time there is movement, it'll be very definitive, very deliberate, very steady, very methodical type of energy being pushed out into the world. Okay? So, that is not to say that this is a fate or a destiny. Stars do not divine. They do not do destiny. They give you the best possible probabilities and possibilities that could possibly exist, and from there you are free to then make your choices. Perpetrators have the same ability to choose as everyone else. And choices, as I've said previously, can be for good or for ill. Okay? So, those are some of the examples of these particular points and these particular in a criminal astrology chart. So, keeping in mind that we never look at the charts in a way that is less than honoring to the victims and to the people involved, including victims, the investigative team, and also the perpetrator, because even the perpetrator has family. Even the investigative team has family. Even the victims, they have family. They have people who have been impacted by the crime. So we want to be as honoring of their feelings and as honoring of their humanity as we can be. Even though in the case of the perpetrator, they were not behaving in a way that was humane. We still have to, or it is wise to, be respectful of the family of the perpetrator, if they have one, even if the family is estranged from the perpetrator at the time of the crime or during the process of the investigation of the crime. We still have to, or we want to. It's wise to. We don't have to do anything, okay? But it's wise to be respectful of their feelings, because this is very painful for the perpetrator's family, the families of the investigative team, in addition to the families of the victim. Okay? So we always want to keep that in mind. And our key takeaway is that the stars guide, but they do not determine. We always have a choice to connect with the stars or not at all. That's up to us. We're not obligated to do that. We're free to make any choice, understanding that all choices have consequences, regardless of whether or not we see those choices up front immediately or somewhere during the process. The fact still remains that our choices will have consequences for good or for ill, regardless of our intentions. And so this is where we leave it for this week. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. It's been great. Next week we'll have yet another episode. And if you like what you're hearing, like, subscribe, and share on whatever podcast platforms you listen to podcasts on. Please give us 5 stars. It helps people find us, and we really appreciate you. Thank you very much. If you like to read reviews, please feel free to do that and share our podcast and content widely so that other people have the chance to hear us and benefit as well. There is a newsletter. It's called The Daily Stargazer, and if you want to hear about what the stars are doing at this moment in time, that's the place to go. There's a free and a paid version. The free version is the only option currently right now, with the paid version coming in the near future. And so thank you very much. And also, wait a second, do follow us on Instagram, Pinterest, or YouTube. You'll find those links in the show notes. And until next time, keep your head to the sky, but keep your feet on the ground. Peace and astral magic.